Hello, my name is Mauricio, and I'm thrilled to welcome you to the talk, Leveraging Research for Real-World Policy Impact, the UK All-Party Parliamentary Group as an Example. I'm excited to introduce you to Caroline Baylon. Caroline Baylon is part of the Secretariat of the All-Party Parliamentary Group for Future Generations, and she's a research affiliate at the University of Cambridge's Centre for the Study of Existential Risk. Her research focuses on cybersecurity, AI, and defense topics, and she also served as rapporteur and an expert member of the European Union Agency for Cybersecurity's ad hoc working group on AI cybersecurity. In addition, she has a background in foresight, serving as a facilitator for an executive education course on planning taught at Oxford's Said Business School. And previously, Caroline Baylon was the lead on cybersecurity at Chatham House, where she headed projects on issues including cybersecurity threats to critical infrastructure, notably on those nuclear facilities and satellites. She holds a Master of Science in Social Science of the Internet from Balliol College at the University of Oxford, and a Bachelor of Arts in Economics from Stanford University. Today, Caroline Baylon will be discussing how the All-Party Parliamentary Group for Future Generations can serve as an example for researchers seeking real-world policy impact. We invite you to use the Swapword platform during the session. On the right side panel, feel free to share your thoughts on the live discussion board and leave and upvote any questions for our speaker so they can answer these at the end of their presentation. After the session, we invite you to use Swapword to set up meetings with fellow conference attendees. Without further ado, welcome, Caroline.
Thank you so much, Mauricio. That was such a comprehensive introduction, and it's so nice to be back at Stanford, so thank you so much. So I understand that there's a number of university students who are within the audience today, and that you're really interested in finding solutions to some of the existential risk issues that you feel strongly about. And so I thought for my talk, if it would be useful if I spoke about ways to use your research to influence government policy, including on issues involving existential risk. So as Mauricio mentioned, a lot of my work is at the intersection of the research and the policy space. So I'm going to talk today about two different approaches you can use. So I'll start by talking about how you might have impact by working for government directly. And specifically, I'll use the UK Parliament as an example. And then I'll talk about working in think tanks, which is also an effective way for your research to have real-world policy impact. So as Mauricio mentioned, I'm based in the UK, and I work for one of the all-party parliamentary groups. They're called APPGs for short in the UK Parliament. And what they are and how they work can be a bit opaque, even to people who are British. And so for those of you who aren't familiar with them, APPGs are groups in the UK Parliament. They have an unofficial status, and they bring together members of all major political parties, and also of both houses of Parliament, so the House of Commons and the House of Lords. And they bring people together around a particular topic of concern or interest. And so the one that I work on is called the APPG for Future Generations. Our goals are focused on raising awareness of existential risks, of the need for longer-term thinking in policymaking, and on the impact that policies today will have on future generations. So APPGs are a way for organizations outside Parliament to work closely with parliamentarians. And so many APPGs have an organization outside Parliament that provides the secretariat that runs the APPG. And so these organizations are often charities or NGOs or campaign groups. In the case of our APPG, it's a think tank. So myself and my colleagues that comprise the APPG secretariat are research affiliates at the Center for the Study of Existential Risk at the University of Cambridge, which is a think tank focused on studying existential risks. I know some of you are familiar with it. So now that I've explained a bit about what APPGs do and about the one I work for in particular, I'll talk about how they can be a way to leverage research for direct policy impact. At the moment, we've been conducting an inquiry on improving long-term thinking and policymaking that I've been leading on. An inquiry is a term used in Parliament for essentially a report that scrutinizes an aspect of government policy. So some of the questions that our inquiry is looking at include, to what extent is a lack of long-term thinking a challenge in policymaking? I know a lot of people in the audience are really interested in that aspect. What are some of the root causes of excessively short-term thinking in UK government and policy? And how can we better incorporate long-term thinking in the policymaking process? As, of course, we're really focused on identifying meaningful policy solutions. So that gives you an idea of what we're looking at. And running an inquiry generally involves gathering evidence from experts, both oral testimony and also written evidence. And we've had some very senior people giving evidence. We've had former ministers and ambassadors, senior academics. Coming up next, we have Professor Angus Deaton, who won the Nobel Prize in Economics for his work on inequality. And of course, the parliamentarians who are members of the APPG are very engaged in this process, and they ask a lot of questions during the sessions. And so that's obviously a great way to get them involved. And the idea is to produce a final inquiry report. And then we aim to get that report debated in Parliament once it's out in order to get even more visibility. So that was to give you one example. To give you another example, the APPG recently published a research paper on risk management in the UK that focused on COVID, which was led by my colleague Sam and that I co-authored with him. And so we held a launch event in Parliament to be able to share and discuss some of the key ideas in the paper with parliamentarians. And we also approached one of the parliamentarians who had been a key supporter of the APPG to see if he would be willing to propose a parliamentary committee on risk assessment and planning. And so he was willing to do that. And so that committee is now up and running. And so they're therefore very focused on this topic. And we were also able to feed the research paper into the committee as written evidence. So that was great as well. And I'll also share a few lessons I've learned from working on the APPG if you want your research to have the maximum policy impact. The first is that it's really important to have cross-party support if you want to see meaningful policy change. And this for me was, I think we're very, very polarized at the moment, whether it's in the US or even in the UK, in the US specifically. And I think this was really a wake-up call for me when I was working on the APPG. So, for example, because I mean, we do all need to work together if we really want to see change. And so, for example, one thing that's important is making sure that you get input and feedback on your draft research paper from key people in all of the major political parties. That's really important. And of course, that's one thing that the APPGs are placed to do well, because by their nature, they bring together all of the parties. And then another factor is that access to information is often a barrier. And so you need to spend a lot of time figuring out how things function and where and how you can feed your research in to have impact. When I started working in Parliament, I was surprised by just how complex parliamentary procedures were. And I really struggled to sort of understand how everything worked. And then, of course, the House of Commons and the House of Lords have different rules and different ways of doing things as well, just to make things a bit more complicated. And so at first it was a lot of talking to people to learn about different types of committees, for example, and how we might be able to get research before them. Just sort of figuring out how we could feed into that process took a lot of time. And then, I mean, of course, all of this doesn't just apply to Parliament, but just to governments as well, and how governments function. And there's also a lot of opportunities beyond APPGs in order to feed your research into Parliament. For those of you who have a PhD, there are academic fellowships, for example. And I mean, there's quite a large number of ways. And, you know, I'm happy to talk about that more during the Q&A. And I know a number of people in the audience are interested in working in the US. So I'm less familiar with the US Congress, but in the US Congress, some of the caucuses that are centered around particular interest groups might be what are the most similar to APPGs, especially since they're bipartisan and bicameral. And so that might be one avenue for you if you're really looking to have impact. And so then I also wanted to talk a bit about think tanks as another way to use research to influence policy. And of course, the term think tank can mean a lot of different things. When I use the term, I'm thinking about what most people would typically think of as a think tank, which is a research institute that produces policy research, essentially. I should mention, well, as Mauricio mentioned, I've worked a lot in the think tank sector. I used to be the lead on cybersecurity at Chatham House, which is one of the major UK think tanks. And I've also worked for many years for a smaller think tank called the Center for Strategic Decision Research. And so I'll share some lessons learned from working in think tanks if you want to have a maximum positive impact on government policy. If you can get a job for the most high-profile think tanks, it does make a significant difference in terms of the impact of your research. Not only do people pay a lot more attention to the reports that they put out, but those think tanks also have really good media teams. So a major report is going to make it into the big newspapers, and you might even get a slot on air at some of the top news outlets. And then, of course, the politicians that you want to influence with your research will read about it or see it. In some cases, their teams may even reach out to you directly to have you come present your report to them, or you might get requests from similar requests from international organizations, maybe some of the UN bodies. And so that's a really, really major benefit of being associated with a high-profile think tank. Of course, if you're working for a smaller think tank, you can also be proactive. You can share your report with key people that you're hoping to influence. Another thing, if you're working for a smaller, less well-known think tank, you can still have quite a lot of impact. In that case, a good technique can be to align yourself with senior individuals, or else to form partnerships with major organizations, maybe a partnership for an event or a paper, maybe a major international organization like the UN or a government, and that can be a really important way to get credibility. And then the last point, or almost the last point I'd like to make is the importance of thinking through your funding sources carefully. If you want to ensure that you have an effective and a positive impact on policy. So funding is always an issue, because when you're working for a think tank, you're generally spending a lot of time looking for funding. And of course, you want to make sure that your funding sources aren't biasing your research. So best practice would be that if you're fundraising for a particular project, you want to try to have diversity of funding. So for example, if you have a corporate funder, you might try to balance that out with a government funder and maybe also a foundation. And so in that way, no single funder is able to dominate. There was a big story in the New York Times back in 2014 that alleged that foreign governments were essentially buying influence with the US government by funding think tanks in Washington. So some of the think tank researchers said that they felt pressured for their reports to take positions that aligned with the agendas of the governments that were funding those think tanks. And in particular, the story pointed to a number of authoritarian, undemocratic regimes that were providing this funding. And so these are that's just essentially to give you an idea of the space. So those are all of the considerations that you want to keep in mind when you're putting together your project funding plan. And then the very last point I'd like to make on research and policy, and then this is again based on things I've observed, it's the importance of thinking through the full policy implications of any policy proposals that you put forward. Just because sometimes some of the things I've seen is policies that are well-intentioned that can sometimes have unintentional negative consequences. And so it's really important when you're doing your research, really thinking through all of the possible repercussions of your proposals, and also to test them out on a wide range of experts, in the drafting phase. So I'll stop there, as this was really just to get the discussion started and give you some ideas on how to leverage your research for policy impact. There are a lot of other ways as well that we can talk about in the Q&A. So thank you so much, and I look forward to chatting.
Thank you so much for sharing your experience, Caroline. It was really interesting to hear how strategic decisions in all these areas can help people better achieve positive impact with their research. So let's dive into questions. One that people might be wondering about, you've talked about several of the activities that the APPG has been engaging in. So from this experience, I'd love to hear if there's certain tactics that have been especially successful that you'd recommend to others pursuing similar initiatives, or if there's some tactics you tried or considered but would now not recommend.
Let's see, that's a really good question. One thing, this is less related to the research side of things, but it's definitely related to having impact, is in the UK Parliament, we have PMQs, Prime Minister's Questions, you have all kinds of opportunities to ask questions. Those are the most high profile opportunity, but you've got other opportunities as well for asking questions in debates. And so that can actually be, so parliamentarians basically want to be seen as being engaged in asking questions. And so one way that you can get impact is actually just approaching parliamentarians and suggesting questions. So if you're interested in existential risks, which is I think what most of us, the goal of most of us, maybe you want to suggest some questions on AI or, climate change. And so those questions they'll get the attention of the MPs. They will, if you're really lucky and you're able to get a high profile question, you could maybe, PMQs, you can maybe get the attention of the media as well, but that's much harder to do. But that's a really good avenue. Another as well is you can even try to support the passage of certain bills. So at the APPG, our vice chair is Lord Bird, and so we've been really supporting him because he's campaigning for a bill that essentially takes our responsibilities to future generations into account. And so we've been spending a lot of time supporting his campaign as well. So that's actually another really good way that APPGs can be helpful. So less on the research side, but very much on the impact side.
Thank you. Yeah, to talk a little more about this impact side. There's, from my understanding.
Yeah.
Oh yeah. So from my understanding, there's many or significant number of members of parliament who are engaging with APPG's activities. So how did you first get this foothold in UK politics and interest from parliamentarians?
So basically the credit goes to Cambridge, and actually specifically to two great researchers at Cambridge, Tildy and Natalie. So they were both students at the time, and they really felt that a lot of that basically future generations were getting shafted, and that not enough attention was was really paid to sort of things like climate change. So Natalie actually wrote a report on the topic and on how we could get more representation for future generations. And they were really, I mean, I'm really impressed by the work that they did. They basically just went out there and talked to MPs, introduced themselves, and got MPs to support them, and basically got this group set up as students. So I think I'm glad you asked me that, because I think it shows that at any age, and even if you're a student, you can really do a lot.
Yeah, that's really inspiring. And another question from our audience is, as we've heard in some of the previous talks, people have many different motivations that draw them toward reducing existential risks. And you seem especially interested in the long-term thinking angle of it. So what draws you to this angle of reducing existential risks?
So I should mention that as an APPG, we really do 3 goals, which is existential risks, long-term thinking, and future generations. It's true that I personally support all of them, but I am particularly interested in the long-term thinking angle myself. Part of it, so my specialty is cybersecurity and defense policy, and it's just really striking the lack of long-term thinking that we have. I mean, now I'm going to start a whole political discussion, but you know, in the UK, we've had a lot of political discussions recently about Huawei, which is a Chinese company, and so they have, well, it's unclear, but we think that they have a lot of government support, and there's concerns that equipment might be backdoored, but they're the cheapest supplier. And so as a result, we basically gave a lot of contracts to Huawei at one time just because it was cheaper without really thinking through the repercussions. And so now, some years later, finally, the UK is basically clawing all that back. And so it's costing us so much more money just because we wanted to save money in the short term. So I think for me, cybersecurity, it's in my field, it's just, we see it all the time, the lack of long-term thinking. And it's kind of, and it's even worse because we're not even tackling it properly. So, you know, the problems that we have are essentially just getting magnified as opposed to trying to close that gap.
Yeah, these definitely seem like really pressing issues. We can maybe shift gears to go back to talking a bit about the research side of having impact. So you gave some great suggestions on how the context and communications around research can help people have more impact. Could you share a bit more about what aspects for the making the content of research relevant to policymakers, students and researchers might want to know about?
Could you just, so I understood the question about media, and then what was the last part?
In making decisions about the content of research, so what people research and how they go about it, but what can make research especially relevant to policymakers?
Okay, so to make sure I understand your question, it's sort of like, how do you choose the research topic that you think is the most important? Yeah, that's a really good one. I mean, one of the things that we're thinking about doing as an APPG is some sort of horizon scan, taking a look at, so this is a possible idea for next year, that we might sort of do some sort of annual horizon scan that's looking at existential risks. And then when you do an activity like that, I think it does really help you in order to figure out what your priorities are. You know, you've essentially sort of done a survey, and then that can really help draw to light what some of the most pressing issues are. But the truth is, people do see priorities very differently. So I think, you know, you have to do your best analysis, and I think getting input is really important, because I mean that's what's so valuable, is we all do have different views on what the most important issues are. So horizon scans are definitely best done in a big group setting, just to get that maximum number of perspectives, and that'll really help you prioritize as well, just group discussions to come to an answer. And diverse groups are really important. Age, diversity, and where you're from, and all of those factors.
Yeah, thank you so much for that and for the session today. That's all we have time for this session for now. So thank you for a wonderful session and for your time with us today.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.